Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. So good to see you all. Faith and science is in the news all the time, and there are some scientists, I think, who sell books by making sure that they're setting up a dichotomy, which I think is a false dichotomy, between science and religion, science and faith, science and believers. And that is one of the motivating factors for my asking a friend and teacher, Mark Richardson, to be here this morning with us. Someone who really knows that arena and can help our conversation advance. He'll speak for a few minutes, and then you can, I hope that you're ready with all of your questions to pose to him. Let me introduce him a little bit to you. He is the president and dean of the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and that's a lot of initials, so let me tell you what that's about. That's our Episcopal Seminary in the Bay Area. We have several seminaries throughout the country, and this is the one that's closest to us. And I'm very, very attached to the seminary because it gave me an honorary doctorate. And anybody who's willing to give me an honorary doctorate, by George, I'm attached to that seminary. Mark has been the president and dean there since October 10, after more than a decade as the professor of theology at the General Theological Seminary. Let me translate what that is now. The General Theological Seminary is the first seminary of the Episcopal Church, and it's located in New York City. And so for him to leave the mothership and come out here to the West Coast was a big gift to us living here on the West Coast. He's an Episcopal priest, a scholar, lecturer, theologian. He's written extensively on faith and science, on same-sex relationships, and on evolution. He received a BA in history at the University of Oregon. He received his Master of Divinity degree from Princeton and his PhD in philosophical theology from the GTU, where he taught theology in the 1990s. And that's a consortium of schools in the Bay Area. Former parish priest who has worked and studied on both coasts. He is the founder and director of the Science and Spiritual Quest Project of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. And some of you may be aware of one of the greatest resources for continuing education for people throughout the country. We Episcopalians really focus in on that, and that is called the Trinity Institute, sponsored by Trinity Wall Street. He is the moderator of the Trinity Institute conferences and is the senior theological advisor still at Trinity Church Wall Street. He and his wife Brenda live in near the campus at Berkeley. They have 3 children. Will you please warmly welcome our friend Mark Richardson? Welcome, brother. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. This is great. It's wonderful. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this morning also because I've known about this congregation for years, but never been here. And my admiration for it grew working with Rick Felton in spite of his biases. And it grew even more this morning, and being with you in worship. You're messengers of the gospel, not of just being saved from something, but for something, which came through. You want this up closer? Okay, thank you. So thank you for that worship service. I was moved by it, and it was a good start to my day. One of my goals as the president of CDSP is to press our students toward greater confidence in leadership at the interface of church ministry and public life, morally, spiritually, and intellectually. Whether it be in social institutions, in the engagement with, or in the engagement with intellectual culture. In fact, this has to do with my presentation. I want to lift up examples from within the Anglican tradition of those who responded to changes in culture which followed from evolutionary consciousness. The genius of Anglicanism, I believe, is its incarnational core. the sense that God's Spirit is infused into the very fabric of nature and history. It is deep exploration and experience of our life in this world where we have our greatest intimations of God. The basic impulse that these theologians I want to talk about had was that if God is one, then the universe the scientist explores and the universe about which we make claims from the standpoint of faith is the same universe. And so we ought to be awake, alive, and exploratory about how we connect our time in this universe with long-held faith, expecting our faith to be enhanced and deepened and not blocked by this interface of theology with the natural sciences or religious faith with the natural sciences. So I want to make the case that evolution has a bearing on specific things in matters of faith, such as the way we talk about Jesus. Does an evolutionary account of our universe affect the way we tell our story? I center this theme in discussions occurring in the early part of the 20th century because it was a prolific time of theological writing, basically a half a century after England had been marinating or digesting the life of Darwin and evolutionary consciousness in their own culture. We know why evolution was troubling to some of the religious conservatives. Evolution's account of millions of years of living species, countless numbers of them going extinct, while others come on the scene until we arrive at the present. If an all-perfect God created things once in the garden and called them good, then how do we account for a human species arriving as a branch in a vast network of life, all rooted in a common material base? According to evolution, says Joan Roughgarden, an Episcopalian and Stanford biologist, when you hug a tree, you're hugging a relative. But I respect, in a different sense, the conservative voice, and this is the reason why. Their beliefs were clear enough to know why evolution matters and why it had to be rejected, so far as they were concerned. And I sometimes am troubled by more progressive Christians who are okay with evolution, but do not take the next step and ask how it matters to our prayer, our faith utterances, our walk with each other, and our trust in God. How would it matter to the way that we conceive the universe? So I've urged so far that we ought to engage in dialogue at the interface of evolutionary theory and religious faith, but that's only the beginning. It's kind of a tricky thing. How do you do that? How can a technical science such as biology be related to the most comprehensive level of human activity such as religious faith? Because actually, faith should embrace everything, shouldn't it? After years of gathering scientists and theologians together in dialogue and listening also to what goes on in popular culture, what I have come to see is that much of the cultural dialogue that goes on today is not about evolution as it anchors the technical work of everyday science. Rather, it is the interpretation of the sciences on the scale of meaning-making we do as human beings where the engagement occurs. It is evolution as it more broadly has affected our understanding of time, our understanding of life in a physical cosmos, and the intricate interdependence of structures and systems within that universe. And this involves biology mediated to theology through cultural ideas that allow us to experience the connection. I want to take you back as an example of what I'm talking about to Darwin's own period of time, just for a second. In the mid-19th century, this was not just a time of evolutionary consciousness in nature. It was a time of great awareness of historical consciousness also. In both nature and history in this era, there was an awakening to the view that novelty and new realities come into being through a process of time. Now, we take this for granted. We've swum in those waters now for a century. We're so used to it. But for centuries before, change was a sign of imperfection, not a sign that created reality is in the making. This was a revolution in the consciousness of Western cultures. Now the possibility could arise for the believer that creation is not a once-for-all fixed thing, but creation is continuous. And natural mechanisms are the mode of that creativity of God. The 19th century was come to recognize something new. But the problem is this, even with what I've said so far. Evolutionary explanation in biology is natural explanation based on material causal principles in the past. If you know the initial conditions about an organism and its environment and so on and so forth, you have maybe not the means of prediction, but a reasonable explanation about what comes about. But you and I think of ourselves as having intentions, acting on the basis of purposes and meaning, the things that history and culture are made of, and moving towards some future destiny. So whereas evolution eliminates purpose altogether and explains things from the past, history and personal action is driven by meaning, not just mechanism, and anticipates the fulfillment of purposes. So both the temporal dynamic of philosophy of history and of nature had this sense of dynamic in time, side by side, but they were fundamentally in tension. Now, one more mediating step, and I'll get down to the theologians. But first, I have to set this up a little bit. The early part of the 20th century saw this problem. They saw this tension between a philosophy of history that had a sense of telos and a philosophy of evolution which had a causal natural network that really looked backwards. How were they going to resolve the tension? And in this context, there arose a philosophy of emergence. Stated briefly, emergence was the idea that the evolutionary mechanism, when seen in a large enough scale of time, presents a picture of certain propensities or patterns. If we look over a long enough stretch of evolutionary time, we see an emergence from matter to life, to sentience, and to spirit. New structures coming into existence from simpler ones. Indeed, the emergent philosophers were asserting that nature itself has a history. The causality that we experience at the sort of intricate micro level of evolution shows itself on the larger canvas of time to be a story about matter moving towards something more complex and rich in combination of unpredictable yet ordered processes. Why is this important to consider? This is the case in point of a mediating cultural idea which linked natural science to more comprehensive quests for purpose and meaning that occupies the human spirit. So in summary, we're in an environment, if we go back to that early 20th century time I was talking about, where emergence theory is in the air, number one, where two, it affected the theologians I'm naming in a minute, and three, it offered a picture of the human species as not a fixed thing plopped into the physical universe, but the human being a species in the making, emergent from other forms of life. We are not so much actors on the stage of nature as fruit on nature's tree. So let's consider one way this made a difference in theology, how we talk and pray our life. Let's consider one way this mattered to some of the progressive theologians of that era, and why it kicked up an allergy to evolution among the conservatives. To do this, I want to go back to a central story of Christian faith about human origins to make the case. Much of the history of theology in the West is about the God-human relationship somehow set apart from the rest of nature. The picture language of Genesis, for example, depicts us as made of the earth, to be sure, but as the story continues, the Spirit has been uniquely breathed into the human being. Humanity in such a narrative is more like the sole actor on the stage of nature in a spiritual drama than like fruit on nature's tree. The human being is not only set apart, it has a degree of freedom that arises above the rest of finitude. Think about the way the Genesis account has been treated in the mainstream of Christian thought. This human being was considered free enough, powerful enough to act in such a way that it could be considered rebellion against God, causing a rupture or disorganization in nature itself as a consequence. The familiar story named The Fall set the terms for why there is so much suffering, death, and violence. These are products of a rebellious human will. What began as an original good of creation is lost and needs to be restored. Some might argue, well, this is just the way the literalists used that from Augustine forward. But in fact, we've gone beyond that in the 20th century, and our best theologians give an existential or symbolic reading of that story. But I don't agree. I think most of those, I'm thinking of Reinhold Niebuhr, I'm thinking of Paul Ricoeur and others, still have a three-staged logic of the old story. That is the logic of an original ideal, the lost ideal, and the ideal restored in their picture of human origins and our particular condition. Now turn to the worldview in which such a picture of the fall originated. Turn away from it for a minute and start again, but this time with an emergent picture of continuous creation. And let's go back and think about that same topic of human origins. Now the background of emergence for understanding human origins. In this worldview, the human being is in the making, so to speak, and more likely coming into moral capacities very slowly and within a very complex environment where death, suffering, and violence are already part of experience. One is more likely to imagine these beginnings of moral and spiritual consciousness to be quite fragile, and in a context more like an entangled jungle than a harmonious garden. One imagines this as trial and error process in a very slow species movement from self as the center of value to widening horizons. And under these conditions, reading theology through the eyes of emergence, it is fair to ask, fall from what? What ideal picture have we projected onto the primordial past? The slow and bumpy road toward moral and spiritual existence was probably more like the trial and error of a 3-year-old who wants to see how fish live after he's knocked over the fishbowl. The child isn't rebelling, the child is exploring. But there are still consequences because the fish dies. By analogy, there are real consequences of moral awakening, real tragedy. But if human rebellion cannot sufficiently explain the origins of suffering, death, and violence, then attention for the monotheist must turn to the question, what was God up to in creating a world such as this? How will we protect the axioms of divine goodness and holiness in a different way? So this poses a challenge. If God is the source of all there is, and not just the experience of wonder and beauty in the natural world, then of course God is the source of suffering and death, which are inseparably built into the fiber of our finite natural world being what it is. It's just part of a finite world and its processes. Our human experience of this may include descriptions such as we have had in the past. We will experience historical tragedies and personal suffering as occasions of loss of meaning, of alienation and anxiety, which we have called sin, as symptoms of the struggle of moral beings in this kind of a natural world. But the problem is not in the description. That description we could have had before or after evolution. The problem is in the explanation we give for that condition in the first place. Is it a fallen universe? The emergent philosophers said no. So how did this set up the thought of some of the theologians of that era? How did these British theologians respond to this evolutionary emergent view? My examples come from British modernists in the 1920s and their liberal Anglo-Catholic contemporaries, and a little word about each. The modernists and liberal Anglo-Catholics wanted to live within the pressure of being faithful to religious tradition while also being engaged with contemporary intellectual culture. They were motivated to find some interface with evolution, and they found the emergent philosophy a good vehicle for it. The modernists went one step further. They thought that if one wanted to speak about God's action, it would be more like breaking out from within the world than breaking in from without. You notice the basic picture of transcendence that we have is that God intervenes from outside at major moments in history. But the view of the modernist was that the real disclosures of God is God breaking out from within. Now, the liberal Anglo-Catholics were slightly different in this respect. Not slightly, it's actually kind of a major thing. They shared this much ground, but they took emergence seriously, yet in the end they were theists with a more pronounced God-world distinction. God's central acts in history are interventions from outside. Okay, so keep those two pictures in your mind as I run through the next bit. With this as background, consider the words of the Anglican theologian Bethune-Baker, who insisted that the creation-fall restoration program of Western theology, in light of evolution, could not be sustained. According to him, sin is tragic, but it is not useful to tie nature and history to an imagined loss of primordial goodness. We know enough about humanity's history, he said, to be able to say that it has been from the beginning a splendid struggle against almost overwhelming odds. Whatever plan there is, it has been part of that of human beings should fight his own way to higher stages of being and life. Well, there's a certain kind of romantic optimism and heroism in that comment. But the chief point is this: there can be no question of restoring what has never been. Creation as a very gradual shaping and building process leading to the production of spiritual beings, with that in mind, we ought to slough off most of the ideas which have given us doctrines of atonement and work out instead a doctrine of Christ, the consummator. Christ does not restore by paying a price to God. Christ completes or anticipates the completion of God's creation. One of his own contemporaries, Charles Raven, in fact, one of his students, assuming with the philosopher's emergence that the inherent oneness of regularity of the natural order stretches unbroken from the amoeba to you and me, took a realistic view of this shadow side of emergence, the jagged line of ascent filled with blind alleys. And with memory of World War I in the backdrop, he said, "The freedom of spirit and communion is won through error, and no religious optimism must blind us to the cost of the journey. Our ancestors have trodden the way of the cross and left their bones as testimony." So there is a sense of the tragic side of the kind of universe we live in, but it changes the question of what we must do in response to that. So I won't go into examples of liberal Anglo-Catholics, because pretty soon Ed's going to jump up and tell me to sit down. In fact, I'm going to run out of time to do everything that I want to do. But what I would like to say about what does it say about Jesus? I would ask you to think of this when you reflect when you go home. If you change your answer to the question, what went wrong, it will inevitably change the answer to the question, how does it get fixed? Right? If the problem, as Bethune-Baker suggests, is not that the world is fallen, but that it is unfinished, then a different kind of burden is placed on who Jesus is for us. No longer is he pictured as restoring us to a state which never existed. Now, so what are some of the things that they had to say about Jesus? Bethune-Baker writes that God, transcending the process in which he is nonetheless inherent, and of Christ as the supreme manifestation of him that has emerged in this process, God indwells nature and history, and Christ is interpreted as the supreme manifestation of this divine reality. that has emerged in the process. The achievement of the human race, but every person is born into this as a child of God. So this is a picture of the incarnation from within a created universe, not plopped down from outside. Raven followed up with similar comments. He believed that salvation is in the promise of the completion of God's creation, not the total remaking of a ruptured creation. So these are just samples. I could go further. I'm going to drop that. I want to just say a few words in evaluation of this kind of a taste, and that's all I've been able to give you at this moment. The more Catholic theologians could revise theology up to a point, but then abruptly and without explanation, they introduce incarnation as a universal, absolute intervention of God in nature and history from outside, to redeem, divinize, and to reveal. According to them, incarnation represented a decisive before and after moment of history, distinguishing new and old ages. But what is there about an evolving picture of time that prepares us for introducing eras of this kind? And where is the evidence for introducing such imagery for capturing the truth about our existence spiritually and morally? One wants to know what warrants the claim that things have changed on the scale that this view of Christ proposes. Now, we can't overlook the maybe false optimism of those who took the position of the modernists. But I think that they were more consistent in the way, in spite of it, in the way that they looked at Christology. I mean, their lack of criticism of the downside of this picture led someone a generation later, like H. Richard Niebuhr, to say about liberals that they worship a God without wrath, bringing men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through a ministration of Christ without the cross. Not a very flattering portrait. But can't one turn the tables and ask this question? What does the fall explanation for the condition of the human being contribute to the solution to human violence and suffering? How have pieties centered in lamb-slaying, debt-paying, and all manner of ways to describe intervening substitutions in the middle of history to redirect the fall made a difference? If Christ has come from outside history to change history, then where is the evidence for the change that marks a beginning and an end? Isn't it more the case, like William Temple said, that the profoundness of Jesus is that he says is that he lives in a complete way, what is always the case about God? So there are no defining lines that divide history that way. Granted, the modernists had settled for a more modest Christology. Jesus is the lens through whom we see God and the future to which God draws all of creation. I'm going to just skip some lines here so we can have some talk. Are you all right? Okay. I'm just about finished. Got a page. It's double-spaced. Grace. All right. I'll live in the grace. Thank you. Jesus inspires change in the human heart and in human community and offers an example of a corrective path morally and spiritually. So incarnation, we can still say, reveals, inspires, transforms, and pioneers, and comes from within nature and history, not from above it. There is no substitution, no before and after of history, primarily because there is no buy-in to the idea of some lost nature that needs to be recovered. So in an evolutionary emergent explanation, it should not surprise us that the production of a moral species on the shoulder of other species would lead both to moral successes in the building of community and culture and tragic and catastrophic failures leading to violence all along the way. And to this condition, Jesus represents the divine intention that we bear each other's burdens, learn and be transformed by friendship, and to see the face of God in the face of the other, to discover ever richer forms of community, and finally to discover the costliness of self-giving love built into the divine life itself. In this model of Christian faith, we see these things supremely in the figure of Jesus, so that in him we see God. And this precisely is the meaning of the Incarnation. In this respect, the modern solution is modest but practical. So the last 4 lines. I'm compelled by this picture. Its spiritual tone is compassion. We all struggle to reach a higher moral spiritual ground in the face of our anxiety and the reality of death. We need holy compassion and must offer it. That becomes the principal spiritual disposition of this kind of faith. The saving effect of Christ is discerned in what we do with it once it has inspired us. Thank you for your attention.
Stay right there.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to ask the first couple of questions. There's a mic there and mic here. So both of these. Over here is another one. Yeah, okay. Joseph and then Niles over here. Paul? Oh, that's fine. So now that we have those mics situated, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask the first question. So let's just mark this moment as being profoundly and radically countercultural. Okay? Let's just say that right now. These are not the waters in which Fox News swims. These are not the waters in which televangelists swim. And I think these are not the waters in which the science against religion debate swims. I also want to mark this moment for those of you who've been around when we've had our friend James Carroll here, that this is precisely what he has said. It is more helpful for him to see Jesus not as Savior, but as revealer. Jesus as epiphany, not as something that comes from the outside in. So let's just take a deep breath about that. just mark this moment. And with the understanding that you and I think a lot of us who are resident with you this morning are coming to our presidential debate, to our debate about health care for women, about the polarization in our country, to whole economic justice issues with a very, very different theology. How, Mark, do you engage people who want to argue with you and they are simply coming from a different premise than you are? Just give us a scenario.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. Yeah, I would agree with Ed that there are political implications to whatever theology you have. And if there aren't, then it's not a very good theology. And so there are political implications to what we're talking about this morning that I think are pretty important and potent. And I think the tragic side of what we're going through culturally right now is that we don't have the tools for seeing the kinds of things that are said at this interface between our religious faith and the sciences. And so oftentimes we get in the popular press a picture of warfare that really bores those who take part in this kind of thing at a richer level. And probably that includes you, because this is a congregation of educated, perhaps non-specialists, but educated people who probably reflect on these topics. But I think our failure from the standpoint of having a different picture from the more conservative theology is that we've not teased out the implications that would fall from the ease with which we have on these issues of accepting evolution. We've not seen what the implication is and found the sound bites and, as liberals, maybe the actions that show a different way of understanding that same story. So I think there's a lot of work to do. Yeah.
So, and we can have your manuscript to put on our website, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's get to the questions. Yeah. Okay. First, Joseph.
Thank you, Mark, for that wonderfully rich, provocative talk. I mean, it is a moment. It is a moment that we should mark because of the theological paradigm shift. In a sense, I'm asking a question that's a continuation of Ed's, because you traced an emergent universe where Christ comes to, as in your words, anticipate and complete. But if the process is trial and error, and let's say, to take just one scenario in that trial and error scenario, we humans with nuclear weapons or with chemical weapons just were foolish enough to destroy this planet, what sort of theological warrant would you have? In the old picture, you have God, the Lord of the universe, who's sovereign, and this constitutes a colossal crime against him. But if God is within, moving in a emergent trial and error way, what warrant is there to stop that, other than, of course, our human stupidity and lack of sense? But there's nothing more than our sort of human trial and error, right?
Yes, I think there may be sort of a general movement over long enough periods of times to higher moral sensibilities and spiritual capacity. But I think you're right. Probably John Cobb was right in his notion of the degree of freedom we have to really destroy at least human life. But we ought to be a little bit careful about whether we're restoring the universe. I mean, the bacteria have outlived us by gazillions of years anyhow. So if we change to see the Imago Dei in terms of all of creation, maybe this is a tragic episode if such a thing should happen. There are certainly risks in this theology. And what it does is it pronounces the relationality. There's no such thing as the graciousness of God as a gift unless it's received. The reciprocity is what makes the relationship. So if we haven't received it, then there's some colossal, catastrophic, possibility in the air. Right. And I think that's part of the risk of the position.
Erica?
Hi. You have been talking about things I've been thinking about for a long time, and I thank you very much. One of the issues that I've been wrestling with, and I don't know if I can articulate the question well, is in the old paradigm, humans have souls, which are sort of non-incarnate spirits. Right. How does this way of thinking describe what a human being's spirit is?
Very good question. And I think what the emergent picture says is that when it comes to the fundamental features of the universe, there is one sort of thing, matter, energy. And you don't have to introduce new things into that because nature itself is more miraculous than we think. So what is the soul under this scenario? It's less an entity that resides in the body and more capacities that belong to certain kinds of complex life. It tends to take us back, really, to an Aristotelian picture, where the soul was the form of the body or that which characterized particular kinds of life. Vegetables had souls, for Aristotle. Animals had souls, and we have sentient and spiritual capacities. But it's not an entity that resides within. It names the capacities that belong to a particular kind of life. And just one further word. Look at how in Scriptures, what is it, which gospel says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, you have a soul which will naturally leave your body at death and go someplace else"? The Gospels are about a new recreative action of God, continuous recreative activity of God, transformative activity. And it presumes anything that which follow us as gift, as creativity, not something that naturally happens to human beings.
Thank you very much for being here. In Lent, we had Father Richard Rohr speaking about his concept of falling upwards in the second half of life. You know that, I'm sure. And in it, he's trying to reject a kind of dualistic thinking or to go beyond dualistic thinking as we mature. I hear something of that in your work, and it seems to me that a film that I've seen recently, that we've seen in Claremont with a visitor named Mary Evelyn Tucker, who did the film on Journey of the Universe, helped us in terms of the symbol systems of seeing the immensity of space from the Hubble telescope and the movement in anthropology through the mammalian kingdom to us, and then connecting the moral question of how do we think about the future as responsible selves, to use the Niebuhr term. How do we build communities in order to deal with this new system? And isn't the environmental issue a huge encouragement for the kind of thinking you are advocating?
Environmental issues such as, just say a word more about what you mean by that.
Thinking about the role of human decision-making having to do with the quality of the air and water and the surface of the earth for coming generations.
I mean, I think basically the Hubble telescope has given us new icons for understanding what it means to be an Earth. I mean, when I see those pictures, I see fragileness, enormous beauty and order, but it's this small little speck of dust in billions of galaxies and whatnot, over 15 billion years. So, I mean, it's just, if size were the issue, we're not too significant. I think there's more to it than that. But it gives me the sense of the fragileness, and to love God is to love God's creation. And you also detected that I have a picture that's not just emergent, but it's probably an element of panentheism, that we are within the divine reality. We dwell within God as you pray. And yet we don't exhaust that divine reality, but we dwell within it. And so we are literally damaging God the way we live. And I think you're a community of people who are not only aware of it, but you have mission connected to these things. And we need to spread it out.
Niles?
Okay. I'm feeling like I'm listening to kind of a clever intellectual tap dance for the last 45 minutes. You've alluded, as you have to the, shall we say, violent or trial and error nature of the physical world that we live in. And yeah, I would go as far as to say that violence is just not in the nature of things, it is the nature of things. That natural selection is a violent process, that the predator capitalist, the predator warlord that we are experiencing all through history, and particularly now in the 21st century, is not an aberration, but the natural outcome of a species evolving through competition for scarce resources, etc. And if I follow that track the way I go, I don't have any particular problem with evolution versus God. But I find evolution versus a benevolent God to be rather contradictory. And, I could believe in a deistic watchmaker God who just starts the thing, takes off and watches, or a sadistic God. Yeah. And I feel like you theologians are starting by defining God as this benevolent being, and then trying to match that up with what you see in the nature of creation, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I think it is a good question, but I'd like to recognize that the things that you say about capitalism, or when you raise it to social systems, you're not talking about science either. What you've done is you've raised the bar to a higher level of interpretation of the science, and you're doing it in a way that Herbert Spencer did earlier. So you have predecessors, and I think it's the mainstream story. I should make that clear. I think the emergent picture is really an offshoot of that. And that the only thing I would say is left out of your story is that I think in systems biology and some of the things that are going on now, the sense of the cooperative, the sense of something beyond just nature red in tooth and claw, it rounds the picture. Again, you know that I'm coming from the standpoint of theology, not from the sciences, but I still think that if you reading all of the literature, that's a potential way to add, to color the full picture.
I grant you that those things are in. Certainly scientific evolutionary biologists have grappled with issues like that, and algorithms and trying to explain what I find with that. But even the social systems of life, just the basic nature of life is that every level of life, except for photosynthesis, depends on another level of life for lunch.
That's right. That's right. When I said we build on the shoulders of other species, without the extinction of many other species, we wouldn't be here. So I think your point is well taken. There's a real gravity in this kind of question, and I agree with you. Theologians begin with certain premises of faith, that there's a certain fundamental graciousness, and yet you can't overlook the brutality, and so you have to be hypothetical. It should be the case that our assumptions are falsifiable over the long term, but I'm not going to give them up easily, nor will the physicist give up a theory easily without testing. But I think we ought to test our faith. I absolutely agree. But I'm going to start with a premise of it and see whether there are pictures that are more integrative than others of it that still are truth-telling. You're questioning whether there's any truth in it, and I grant you that. But I still think there's something to go on. That would be my method of going at the picture. Okay.
So sorry to cut it off. It's been a wonderful time. Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Really great.
Wonderful time. Thank you. Great.